At just 7 months old, a young bobcat named Luca arrived at the Redwood Wildlife Rescue Center. His fur was a thick tapestry of gray and toy brown, speckled with dark spots that hinted at his wild roots, with short black tufts crowning his ears and a tail that ended in a dark tip. Luca looked every bit the untamed feline his species was known to be. But beneath his compact, muscular frame and piercing golden eyes, there was an unexpectedly gentle nature. From the start, Luca was unlike the other rescues. Most bobcats that came through the center were wary, aloof, or sometimes aggressive, rightly so, having come from stressful and often traumatic situations. But Luca was different. He greeted the staff with low, curious chirps and rubbed his cheek against the bars of his enclosure when anyone approached. He wasn't timid, but rather confident in his trust, an unusual trait in a well-adorned bobcat. His favorite routine was curling up near the fencing, where he could watch the other animals and the daily comings and goings of the center. When the other bobcats kept to themselves, Luca approached with a slow, respectful gait, often lying beside them just close enough to share warmth. The staff at Redwood quickly took to him. James, one of the newer handlers, found himself lingering at Luca's enclosure longer than he should. The other men noticed too how Luca would press his forehead gently against the wire when James crouched down to speak to him in a low, calm voice. Luca seemed to respond not just to affection, but to presence. He wasn't demanding or insistent, just quietly hopeful every time someone walked by. Despite his affable nature, months passed, and Luca remained. Other bobcats came and went, rehabilitated or transferred to sanctuaries, better equipped to handle their eventual release. Some were adopted into conservation education programs. Yet, Luca stayed. He wasn't quite wild enough to be released, but too unique to be overlooked forever. Still, with every cage opening that wasn't his, with every farewell that wasn't for him, he waited. The staff couldn't understand why no interest ever came. They had reached out to partners, posted about him on their online pages, even updated his profile with new pictures showing off his glossy coat, his soft expression, and those alert, tufted ears. Still no inquiries. While others grew restless or withdrawn in their enclosures, Luca remained the same, steady, affectionate, and ready. Nearly a year had passed. Luca was a year and a half old now. His limbs had grown long and lean, his gait graceful and quiet as the wind through pine needles. James still visited him daily, though the conversations had become more one-sided. He spoke of the forest trails surrounding the center, of the raccoons that had been especially mischievous that week, and of the silence that sometimes crept in after the sun dipped low behind the trees. The others noticed, too. "He's still here," one of the senior staff murmured one afternoon, leaning against the fence as Luca watched them with unwavering calm. "That cat's got more heart than most people I know." They all believed someone would come. Every creature finds its place, they reminded themselves, and someone did. It began with a message, just like the ones that came in and were often dismissed too soon. But this one had a different tone. It wasn't a question about size, temperament, or health. It was a message from someone who had seen Luca's photo and simply wrote, I can't stop thinking about him. They'd had interest before, fleeting and formulaic. Inquiries that came with too many stipulations, only if he gets along with dogs, only if he likes being petted constantly, only if he behaves like a domestic cat. Luca, though gentle, was still wild at heart. Not a pet, not a novelty. He needed someone who understood that, and this message somehow seemed like it came from someone who might. James forwarded it to the shelter coordinator. He didn't say much, just that it felt different. The coordinator, Thomas, nodded slowly, then clicked on the sender's profile. A name, no picture. A few shared posts about conservation, a quiet profile, but the message stuck with them. Let's follow. Thomas said they did. They asked the usual questions. What drew you to Luca? Have you worked with wildlife before? Why a bobcat? The responses came back. Thoughtfully, slowly, not rushed. The writer's name was Peter. He lived on a stretch of private land near the edge of the Northern Preserve, bordering a patch of protected forest. He had built an enclosure once used for an injured lynx. The lens had passed from old age years ago, but the space remained untouched, secure, surrounded by quiet. I don't know how to explain it, Peter wrote, but when I saw his eyes, I felt like he was waiting, and I've been waiting too, for something I didn't even know I was missing. They arranged a call. Peter's voice was soft, older, like leaves, whispering over a still pond. He didn't try to sell himself, didn't overpromise. He asked about Luca's routines, his feeding habits, what kinds of toys he liked, what calmed him when storms rolled in. When James described Luca's habit of rubbing his head along the wire when someone he trusted approached, Peter was quiet for a long moment. I used to have a dog who did that, he said finally. She was deaf, so touch meant more. The team held meetings. They reviewed Peter's land photos, the structure of his enclosure, the proximity to medical care. They talked to his veterinarian. They debated, argued even, because letting go of Luca finally meant taking a risk. But then James said, maybe it's not a risk. Maybe it's the answer we've been waiting for. That night, James returned to Luca's enclosure. The air was crisp. Sliver of moonlight sliced through the pines, catching on the silver threads in Luca's fur. James crouched down like he always did. Luca approached slowly, gazed calm, and pressed his head to the wire. You might be going home soon, buddy, James whispered. Luca blinked. Once, slow and sure. The next week was full of preparation, paperwork, inspections, approvals. The staff cleaned Luca's space until it gleamed. They packed his favorite enrichment toys, the ones he battered around like a lazy king. They labeled his supplements, his feeding schedule, his favorite brands. On his last day, they opened the gate just wide enough for him to walk through into a carrier fitted with fleece padding and scents he recognized. James stayed with him the whole time. The vehicle drove off, winding slowly down the gravel road that led toward Peter's land. James didn't wave. He just watched, hands in his jacket, eyes shining just a little. Later that night, James returned to the office. He hadn't turned the light on yet. The only glow came from the computer screen, still open to the shelter's inbox. There at the top was a new message. It was a Message from someone who had seen Luca's photo and simply wrote, "I can't stop thinking about him. His name was Polar." Well, that's what the message said. When he finally arrived, walking up the long gravel path to the center, James was surprised to see a tall, quiet man, probably in his early 40s, dressed in a simple forest green coat, boots caked in the kind of mud only known to deep woods. Names. Actually, James, he said when they met at the gate. "Polar is what my friends called me years ago. Guess it stuck." James, handler James, that is, led him to Luca's enclosure. They didn't say much. They didn't need to be words. The moment Luca saw the man, he didn't chirp or press up to the bars like he usually did. Instead, he just walked to the front, slow and deliberate, and stared, not in fear or confusion, but as if he recognized something in this stranger, something that needed no explanation. James the visitor knelt, eyes never leaving the bobcats, and whispered something inaudible. Luca stepped forward. He didn't make a sound, didn't twitch his tail. He simply leaned forward and pressed his forehead softly to the bars, just as he always did with the other James. But this time it was different. They brought him into the meet and greet pen, a larger open space with natural logs and shaded corners. Luca walked right up to the man, circled him once, and sat beside him, brushing his shoulder gently against James's leg. That was all it took. The adoption process didn't take long. James, the man who'd come for Luca, had filled out most of the paperwork before arriving. He'd been watching Luca's posts for months. 2 years earlier, he had lost his companion of 15 years, a lynx mix he'd raised from a cub. The loss had been too much. He'd sworn off bringing another into his life, but time, as it does, softened the edges. He'd eventually gone back to the rescue center, not Redwood, but another nearby, and had adopted a small, shy female bobcat named Clove. She was skittish, delicate, and preferred quiet spaces, but they understood each other. Still, he sensed something incomplete. First, James thought Clove might be lonely, so he built her an outdoor run stretching from the edge of his cabin to the treein, with woven tunnels and platforms made from storm-felled trees. She liked it, but she never played, never chirped. He watched the wind like it might carry away a memory she couldn't explain. James watched her the same way. It wasn't grief, at least not fully. Was a kind of silence they both shared, a bond built on mutual restraint. Then, one night, a storm rolled in hard and fast, the kind that flashes white before the thunder hits. James woke to find Clove not curled in her den, but standing at the end of the run, watching the sky. Something in her posture told him she remembered, too, not just her own past, but his. The next morning, he searched through the pages he'd bookmarked weeks earlier and found Luca again. The eyes were what had stayed with him. Not sad, not pleading, just open like they were still waiting. When Luca leaned against him that first day in the pen, James knew it wasn't about filling a void or replacing loss. Wasn't even about Clove, though he hoped she'd accept Luca in time. It was about finishing something that had started long ago, before the lynx, before the cabin, before he ever told himself he could be whole alone. Transport day came with a kind of reverent stillness. The Redwood team packed Luca's items with more care than they usually showed. Toys, yes, but also blankets he'd favored, with his scent woven into the threads. A log from his enclosure that he liked to perch on. His favorite feeding dish scratched on one side from years of gentle use. James took them all, packing them slowly into the rear of his truck, padded with straw and canvas. Luca didn't protest the carrier. He stepped in with the same calm he had shown all along, as if he already knew the road would lead him home. On the drive, James kept one hand loosely on the edge of the carrier, talking softly about the route they were taking, the turn-off to the valley, how the creek would be frozen this time of year, but the snow had melted just enough to show the moss-covered rocks beneath. When they arrived, Clove didn't run. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, tail low, but not tucked, watching. Luca didn't push forward. He stepped out, sniffed the air, and walked in a wide, slow circle around the yard. Then he sat down, facing the trees, not tense, not curious, just waiting. James opened the outer enclosure and let Luca explore at his own pace. Hours passed. Evening. And Clove stayed near the cabin, perched on her log, eyes following Luca, but never intervening. He didn't challenge her space. He didn't try to play. He simply settled into the rhythm of the place as if it were already his. The next few days passed with that same quiet balance. James would catch them, both lounging on opposite sides of the run, not quite together, not quite apart. He cooked in silence, repaired an old fence, added a few branches to the enclosure. Luca watched him work. Clove watched Luca, and the cabin, once too still, began to hum again, soft, subtle, but unmistakable. One morning, James found them curled on the same patch of sun, not touching but close. Clove blinked slowly at him, then tucked her head under her paw. Luca didn't move, but his eyes followed James all the way to the door. That was the first morning. James forgot to feel lonely. Evenings became a ritual. Feeding, a walk along the perimeter trail, then firelight flickering through the windows as the bobcats settled into their separate spaces. James would sit on the porch, sipping tea, watching the trees. Sometimes Clove would sit with him. Other times Luca, rarely both, but that was okay. Still, he sensed something incomplete. That feeling only grew stronger when Luca's face showed up on his feed. Something about those eyes, that posture, that presence. He checked the sense page every day after that, and then he wrote the message. When Luca arrived at his new home, he adapted as though he had been there all along. He padded through the cabin, checked every corner, sniffed the rough cedar furniture, and claimed a perch by the large window that faced the woods. Within days, he had assumed the role of what James affectionately called the refrigerator inspector. Each time the door swung open, Luca would appear like a shadow from the hallway, tail high, eyes alert, and oversee every snack, meal prep, and leftover stashing with silent authority. Clove, however, was not as amused. She kept her distance, often watching from high shelves or darting behind furniture when Luca approached. But Luca never pushed. He followed quietly, lay a few feet away. When she hid, and when she growled, he backed off without protest. His patience was boundless. Slowly, day by day, he closed the distance between them. One afternoon, it happened. Clove perched on the windowsill, allowed Luca to settle beside her. He didn't move close. At first, he just sat. She looked at him, blinked slowly, and after a long moment, reached out with a paw and lightly touched his side. Luca, in turn, leaned forward and gently began grooming her cheek. She didn't move away. From then on, everything changed. They ate beside each other, slept tangled in a pile of warm fur, took turns chasing leaves in the yard enclosure that James had built behind the cabin. Luca had found his place. Not just a roof, not just a quiet bed, but a life, a rhythm, a bond. Back at the Redwood Wildlife Rescue Center, James, the handler, still thought of Luca. Sometimes he looked through the old records, paused at Luca's intake photo, and smiled at how small he had been, how soft-eyed, how ready he'd hear from James, the adopter, every now and then. A photo of Luca and Clove curled up together on the rug, a blurry shot of Luca's face. Halfway inside the fridge, a video of both cats chirping as James chopped venison for their dinner. And every time, he felt that deep warmth, not pride but peace, knowing that one of their own had found what they all hoped for. Luca's story wasn't filled with dramatic rescues or dangerous beginnings. He hadn't come from a broken cage or survived a storm. His was a quiet kind of waiting, a quiet kind of hope, and in the end, a quiet kind of love, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't waver, just waits, knowing that when it finally arrives, it will be worth every moment.